If you have not watched The Joker, stop right now, go watch it. I think you're crazy if you continue without it. It is a really good film, and it'll also make your understanding of this analysis a lot more cohesive. Arthur's justification for murder and violence is set on a basis of meanness, and I think that this traces back very neatly into the childish mentality that he has when it comes to life and the fairness of it all. Penny's delusions stunted Arthur's maturity, and he lacks a lot of understanding of how to function in life as an adult. Her delusions feed into the optimism of how he perceives the world, and she very rarely spoke horribly of the society that they live in. This lack of reality when raising Arthur most likely led to his misunderstanding of how the world works, and him adopting the mentality that morals are based on meanness. But what do I really mean by meanness? When children are growing up, they are taught that being mean is unfair and cruel. This is how we initially establish our moral code. So when someone is being mean to you, that is how you establish their bad character and moral code. This type of immature morality is something that Arthur never really grew out of or matured to understand differently. So often his acts of violence are a consequence of those who have been mean to him. And this is starting off with the Wall Street Three. The three Wall Street men who were initially harassing a young lady in the train end up exploiting Arthur for their own entertainment. They make fun of him and use their strength against him as a means of making them feel superior for a small moment. Their mistreatment of others for their own entertainment establishes this mean characterization for the three of them, and this is also the very first time that Arthur successfully defends himself, and it is from the death of others. This is the very first time that Arthur learns and associates the killings of others with his own liberation, and this is so significant to the rest of the film. It is in that moment that Arthur realized his own emancipation can be achieved through violence. His usual tactics of self-preservation and defense have always been unsuccessful, but this very event of liberation through violence proves most effective. Can we really blame Arthur for feeling like this when this is his only option? In a society where you speak up for yourself but are silenced, in a society where you fight for yourself but are kicked down, what other option is there for the individual, unless you really want to live your life in melancholy? Arthur's hope to be liberated from the confines and expectations of society is lifted, and he can begin living his life with a similar freedom to everyone else, except he has now crossed a moral boundary that cannot be reversed, and his perspective on life has now been flipped on its head. Penny Fleck. Arthur's first acts of successful self-defense resulted in murder, so once he discovers that his mother was ultimately lying to him throughout his life, Arthur's feelings of betrayal are reflected in his actions. Discovering that his condition was caused by trauma from Penny's boyfriend, Arthur can no longer view her as the maternal figure she once was in his life. With all the murders in this film, Arthur is empowered by the gun that he uses. It acts as a symbol for his freedom, except when it comes to his mother. This is the only death in which is done directly with his hands, and I believe that this is very, very purposeful. This murder is personal and entails a lot of ongoing trauma. It completely altered his perception of reality, as everything he believed has now been disproven. Not only did he discover that he was adopted, but he discovered that his condition was caused by her being complicit in her abusive boyfriend's actions. Arthur is now mourning the loss of his mother, as he truly cannot believe that a maternal figure would have allowed such a thing to happen. Penny abused him emotionally and mentally. She gave him a delusional insight on the world. The system put him back into custody with her. She has him looking after her in her old age, almost as if he is her parent, and she has lied about everything. Arthur spent most of his time outside of work looking after Penny, so the betrayal that he experiences is almost indescribable. Penny's state becomes so severe that Arthur began looking after her as a carer. He bathes her, he entertains her, he prepares food for her, he spends most of his time with her, and after all the effort and care he put into their relationship, he discovers that he has been lied to. I think the worst thing about this is that Arthur most likely wouldn't have found out about these truths, and he would have lived the rest of his life being oblivious to the actuality of his life. Arthur uses a pillow to suffocate Penny after she had been admitted into the hospital for having a stroke. Again, it is really important to note that Arthur kills Penny with his own hands rather than returning to the gun, which eventually becomes a symbol for liberation for him. This murder is far more personal than the others, and the betrayal that he experiences is far more disturbing than the meanness. It goes back and beyond the scale of meanness and trespasses into something so much more mature and incomprehensible. Yet, Arthur still hasn't learnt that violence isn't the only way of protecting himself and confronting others. Randall. When Arthur killed Randall and spared Gary, he explained that Gary had always been nice to him, thus his murdering of Randall was due to a scale of meanness and niceness. Arthur doesn't quite understand the nuance and complexity of morality, and as a result behaves in the way that an unmatured child would. If a child was being bullied and the other had the opportunity to join in but refused, they would be considered a good person, and Gary is in the same position as he is also bullied by co-workers and appreciates Arthur's negligence of the scene. Neither of them join in on the bullying, despite how it might help them assimilate with the rest of their co-workers. Gary is one of the only genuine friends that Arthur has, despite how Randall was initially perceived as such a thing. Gary has never taunted Arthur or drawn attention to his condition, and I think this is mainly because the two can empathize with one another about their isolation from society. Randall, though, truly hasn't got any grasp on what it is like being either Gary or Arthur. He even takes advantage of the two, because they are vulnerable or insecure. It is Randall's fault that Arthur gets fired, and in Arthur's mind, the two correlate strongly. At first it seems as if Randall is trying to help Arthur defend himself, but many things point towards the ill nature of Randall in this moment. 1. Arthur refuses to take the gun as he is uncomfortable with the idea, but Randall pressures him to do so regardless. And 2, Randall lies about his involvement with the gun and even adds on to the lie by saying that Arthur attempted to buy a gun from him earlier, which is just a blatant lie. A user on Stack Exchange stated that Arthur's interaction with Randall was to establish the self-serving nature of the world around Arthur and how willing people are to throw others under the bus. And I agree with this wholeheartedly. It's an animalistic world that Arthur lives in, and especially since there is little to no support from communities or the government itself. So we see a lot of mistreatment happening in this society. Some part of me really likes the idea of an alternate universe where Gary and Arthur become closer friends, and this friendship could have helped the both of them to overcome the difficulties of navigating a superficial society. In this world, I like to think that Arthur being able to confide in Gary would have given him the freedom and happiness in life to fulfill him, so that violence wasn't his resolution to a neglectful society. Murray Franklin. We see Murray Franklin insult Arthur's attempt at stand-up comedy on his show, The Murray Franklin Show. Until this point in time, Murray is depicted as a type of father figure for Arthur to look up to. He frequently daydreamed of Murray as someone present within his life, and even saw him as a paternal figure when he watched the show. So, when this overly positive image of Murray is shattered, Arthur's sense of justice and morality relied heavily on the meanness scale. Again, this false sense of optimism for the world has really stunted Arthur's understanding of the society that he lives in. As mentioned, Murray is a great influence on Arthur and can therefore be identified as a father figure in his life. We see this through Arthur's delusions as he watches The Murray Franklin Show. In his delusion, Murray even goes to the extent of admitting, "There's something special about you, Arthur, I could tell," to which Arthur replies with the statement, "I've been the man of the house for as long as I can remember. I take good care of my mother." The very language that we see here is quite immature. Being the man of the house was something typically told to boys, especially if the father went away to war or simply to work temporarily. The praise that Murray gives Arthur for this achievement is reminiscent of that of a father who is proud of their son. This, in Arthur's imagination, is a very significant expression of validation and acceptance. As Arthur wears all blue, it represents his conformity to societal standards and expectations. Furthermore, Arthur confesses with a smile that his mum says, "I was put here to spread joy and laughter." This is similar to how a child recounts what their mother has told them as if they were facts. He is then invited by Murray to come down to the stage for a segment. Dialogue like this shows the naivety of Arthur's imagination and expectations for the world. His dissociative daydreams always reward him instantly for good deeds and work to create a perfect scenario. It is through these daydreams that we are given insight into Arthur's dreams and desires, such as a fatherly figure embracing and accepting him. The childlike language emphasizes his immaturity and lack of realistic experience within the world. You can clearly see the way in which his mother's upbringing affects his mental state, as he has this false perception of good for a world that is predominantly vicious and selfish. The way in which he speaks, along with his vocabulary, is highly reminiscent of a child not knowing any better. He performs in front of others as a child does, highly influenced by the adults around him and the way in which they speak to children. This attitude changes drastically after Murray plays Arthur's stand-up comedy recording for the intention of humiliating the wannabe comedian. It is at this point that Arthur's perspective of Murray shifts dramatically. Fundamentally, Murray is a mean person for his humiliation of Arthur, so this translates to Arthur that this is the only way of liberating and defending himself from this degradation, and that is through violence. When Arthur confronts Murray about his ignorance towards the issues in their society, he raises his voice and exclaims, "You think men like Thomas Wayne ever think what it's like to be someone like me? They don't. They think we'll just sit here and take it like good little boys, that we won't werewolf and go wild." He also mentions, "Have you seen what it's like out there, Murray? Do you ever actually leave the studio? Nobody thinks what it's like to be the other guy." Arthur's language is very much reminiscent of a child, especially when he talks about rolling with the punches. He addresses himself as a good little boy, as if this is what society expects of him, as if this is how he still views himself. But then it is swiftly followed up with the line that we won't werewolf and go wild. Through all of this frustration and anger, Arthur continues to use childlike language, ultimately showing that perhaps it is an inner child that is speaking out of frustration. His clear sense of justice demands answers to all the questions that he has about why the world isn't as happy and charming as he believes it should be. Ultimately, Penny's naivety and frankly her delusions have taught Arthur that this world is a good place. Very rarely is there any harsh reality or seriousness to the way that she speaks about the world. Penny has created this false goodness within the world, and only now is Arthur truly growing into the reality that nothing will change within his life unless he does something about it himself. Sophie. Almost every interaction with Sophie that we see is simply false. Arthur is delusional and has cultivated this relationship within his own mindscape. Now, this next thing is up for a debate amongst viewers. Did Arthur kill Sophie? As there is for most debates, a whole Reddit thread exists on this matter, so I'll link that below. But here are the arguments of why I don't think he killed Sophie. 1. Sophie never harmed Arthur, and aside from his imagination, she was genuinely kind to him. Secondly, he realized that it was in his head and that it was all his delusions, so he did have that realization. 3. Arthur loves children. You can see that when he plays with them on the bus, and he's always trying to make them smile. I don't believe he would actively orphan a child. R.I.P. Batman. 4. The entire relationship is framed really strangely, with the two having this very dark sense of humor, which is always going back to like suicidal imagery. And I feel like it was framed in that way to suggest that he might, but I think it was supposed to be quite deceiving. At least that's what my perception of it was. The last one, number 5, is Arthur doesn't go on like a wild killing spree. He doesn't kill innocent people. He doesn't go out in the streets just shooting his gun. He kills people that have wronged him, and I don't believe Sophie did that. So, I don't know, it's up to the audience, and I think what you do believe kind of says a lot about your perspective on life. A really significant aspect of this moral code is that Arthur never stood up for himself. So when he did, he was put down or neglected, like with his job with Holt, which meant that his efforts went unnoticed and thus created no difference in his life. However, when Arthur resorts to violence, he begins to understand that this may be the only way that he can defend and fight for himself in this world. And that doesn't really correlate with Sophie either. When we first meet Sophie in the movie, she's in the elevator with Arthur, and the colours of the scene shift dramatically. From routinely collecting non-existent mail from the post box with a damp and dreary colour filter, it shifts to the bright colours in the elevator. She coincidentally shares the same type of humour as Arthur, and they both smile at her joke. However, this is only the beginning of his daydream with Sophie and their growing relationship. After meeting Sophie on the elevator and sharing the same joke, the music shifts from the somber cello to The Moon is a Silver Dollar, man that is a tongue twister, by Lawrence Welk and his companions. It is a very upbeat and even romantic piece that fits in with this dissociative daydream. Arthur's dissociation is a coping method most likely due to his childhood trauma. We see that every time Arthur dissociates, the world that we are presented with seems to be exaggerated with a carnival-esque manner. The surrealism becomes evident through the music as it switches from the cello to old charming music. The surreal approach to his dissociation is a representation of the world that he wishes he lived in. The carnival-esque tone that we see through saturated and lively colours is simply childish. By indulging in these false realities, Arthur is satisfying his younger self. I think a really significant aspect of this argument is that Arthur is carrying his trauma with him. He carries that inner unhealed child throughout his life, and this can be very overwhelming, hence his dissociation. I think the ambiguity of Sophie's death is entirely up to the audience, and I do believe that your decision of what he did ultimately reflects your insight on the world and your hope, or I guess lack thereof, in Arthur himself. So that is my analysis. I do think that the Joker is an homage to a damaged child, but tell me your thoughts. What do you think about the movie? Have you watched the new one? Yeah, I want to know. Leave a comment, subscribe if you like this content, and I'll see you next time. Bye.